welcome to episode 58. And it's about time we had a show from Finland with people who aren't from Finland, but living in Finland, as well as people who are in Dubai who aren't from Dubai. They're from Ireland and the UK. And actually, Markos is from Estonia, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right, Markos? And Mark is from, Kircher's from the UK, and then in Dubai, where I met him about 13 or so years ago when he was Mr. Mark at Dubai Men's College. He was in charge of the place because no one liked the Pro Vice Chancellor, so they just put Mark in charge. But I can't say that's being taped.
Well, that's it. Now I can never go back. Thank you, Kurt.
We'll edit that one out. So this is called Unpacking the Digitization and Datafication of Education. Thoughts from Finland and beyond. And we have people who can definitely take us beyond. But we definitely want to hear about what's going on in Finland because we hear about Finland all the time. It's either Finland, Singapore, or Korea, or someplace else in the world. And so we're going to have an interesting show today. And it's a special show. Not just because it's show 58, not just because my best friend Mark Kircher's in with us today, because today happens to be Teacher's Day in Korea. And I am wearing my Teacher Day shirt. And Mark, I brought one for you as well. So you'll have to show up here in Indiana and have a beer with me and get your Teacher's Day celebratory shirt. We have to make this real exciting show. It's also my friend Mink Young Kim's birthday at West Florida. She's from Korea. So it's a special day for people from Korea, a special day for people around the world, because we get to hear from 4, maybe 5 when Markos, everyone's here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have 5 people today. So we have a lot to pack in. And I think Marco is going to start us off with giving us an overview of what's going on at CARDI, which stands for, the first word is critical review, right? Critical applied research for digitization of education. Sorry about that. So Mark's going to take us through what CARDI is, and we got a couple wild cards with us today. In fact, 3 wild cards. He's going to explain what that is as well. So can you give us a 5-minute or so overview, Markos? Marco?
Hey, lovely to see you, Kurt. Thanks for inviting us. Lovely to
Marco,
be on
when did we first meet? At an ACE conference like Global Learn or eLearn or EdMedia?
I think it was actually SITE in San Diego or something like that.
One of those ACE conferences.
It's been a while. Yeah, so first of all, thanks for inviting us. It's lovely that you are interested in our topic. And as you introduced the research group, it's called the Critical Applied Research of Digitalization in Education. And this started sort of back in 2019. I think I got inspired by a conference presentation by a certain George Siemens in Ireland, and he had a keynote on artificial intelligence and machine learning in education, and surprisingly, he actually made a sort of a call for more critical research in this area. And by critical, we don't mean critical as such, like being against of something or being against of digitalization or whatever, but to actually trying to unpack the sort of seemingly obvious things that we take for granted in these topics, and also go a bit deeper how they affect education and so forth. So CARDI sort of came up from that with talks with Mark, Hannah Terras, who is Kurt also knows very well, and well, these two, they've been, I don't know how many decades you've been working with distance learning, Mark, but like 20, 30 years at least, and I've been around moderate 15 years. So we started discussing, should we try to form this type of a research group? And at that time, which was pure luck, the university was establishing new research groups, so internal funding. And so we proposed this and we applied and we actually got this. So we started in 2020. Was that short, Kurt?
And maybe, yes, very short and succinct, but we didn't hear, you're part of a university that's part of a system of universities, because you've merged recently, I believe.
Sure.
And you've also got government funding to do what you want to do. So maybe Mark can explain what that is and give us the title of the university and
Sure.
where you are.
Okay, so yeah, as you can see there, yeah, we're a Tampere University of Applied Sciences, and Tampere is an inland city in Finland. I think it's the largest inland city, in fact. And yeah, we used to have kind of three separate universities. There was Tampere University itself, kind of a very traditional university, Tampere Technical University, and Tampere University of Applied Sciences. But actually, we've now kind of all merged into one group. I guess to kind of give you some context, kind of a suburb or the city right next to Tampere is a certain place called Nokia. And that may be a place you've heard of if you've not heard of Tampere, because it is literally the hometown of Nokia phones. So it's called Microsoft these days, by the way. And that was a bad joke. So Tampere University of Applied Sciences is part of this Tampere Universities group. And yeah, we as an applied science university, we're not looking just at, if you will, kind of academic abstract research, but particularly research can be applied obviously in the real world, and that's there in our name. And as Marco was saying, at the time he and I saw George in Dublin and came away from that conference, it just happened that our own university, which is a public university, all the universities in Finland are public. In fact, there's education here is a public good. It's not seen as a private commodity, and so there are no tuition fees. There's no private schools. There's no. It's a very different, if you will, way of looking at the world in education, maybe compared to some other places. So yeah, we had public funds to start this at the beginning of 2020 and start to, if you will, peel back some of the aspects of digitalization, not digitization, but digitalization and datafication in education. And maybe Marco will want to kind of clarify that point about digitalization, digitization.
Yeah, because that's my next question, actually, Marco. What are the key problems and challenges that Cardi is trying to tackle or wrestle with or grapple with, and how successful have you been to date?
Well, that's a good question, Kurt, because when we started this, we sort of had a certain kind of a research agenda, and then COVID-19 happened, and everything went sort of a bit new. So as Mark mentioned, so we're looking at digitalization, which is more, well, some say that digitization is more about digitizing content to make it digital, so to speak. But digitalization is more of processes and so forth, and ways of operating and so forth. So we wanted to involve teachers more closely with latest developments in these areas. For example, Hannah Terras, she is leading one of the biggest learning analytics project in Finland. There's 11 universities involved, and it's a ministry-funded large project. And so we saw in that project, in Mark's program in Masters of Educational Leadership, that teachers still matter, but it seems that the pressure is quite from the technology point of view. So we wanted to look at more closely how the technology actually affects not only pedagogical processes, but for example, teachers' work in general, which is one research that we're currently doing. Not only like in the classroom, but what other things also are related to teachers' work.
Can I say something to kind of really clarify this word critical, if you don't mind? I know there's some questions I'm seeing there already, but and I might just share the screen. Kurt, could I share a slide? Would that be allowed?
Sure, sure.
I think Zhao might have to give permission for that. And he is listening, so because I think he owns this room.
Okay. Well, okay. So as Marco said, we don't mean critical in the way it's often used in everyday language, which is, the idea that critical in terms of negative, as Marco said, against. And here I am now sharing. So I take a lot of my inspiration actually from this quote from Ira Shaw, which was written back in 1992. But I think this really speaks to what we're trying to do in CADE, which is, by critical, we're trying to get the habits of thought, reading, writing, and speaking, which go beneath the surface meaning, the first impressions, the dominant myth, the official pronouncement, the cliches, and so on. In other words, we're trying to kind of question and get a little bit deeper into the impact of digitalization on education. And by education in its widest sense. So as Marco's already mentioned, with things like the impact of that on teachers, on educators, but also on students, but on institutions and on culture and society. So we're trying to look, instead of just looking at the narratives, kind of, this is how the future's going to be, it's already written, jump on board or be left behind, which we often hear, we're saying, well, hold on a minute, are we letting technology shape us, or are we shaping technology? And that's kind of the route that we're coming from. So I just want to kind of clarify that. We're not Luddites, but we're asking the difficult questions, as it were.
Thank you, Mark, for that. That was actually my question was going to be exactly around that. So you should have preempted that, because I think we hear, there are a couple of things happening here. So one is the sort of the everyday use of the word critical, which you sort of distinguished from. But I think now we are hearing a lot, the word critical has entered into sort of the academic lexicon in a variety of different ways. So you have critical theory, you have critical pedagogy, you have critical digital pedagogy, you have critical race theory. And so I would love to sort of hear from maybe Mark and Marco about how you are articulating that, because this resonates very deeply with me around the work that I've been involved in as well, in sort of looking at not the technical, but the humanistic, and thinking of the future as something that we are building and not something that is predetermined, and so on. So I would love to hear sort of broadly the framework, and then I would love to bring in the wild cards, because I would love to hear from you as to how these ideas are actually playing out in your particular context, right? Because it's one thing for us as academics to sit and think deep thoughts and create multisyllabic phrases which look good on journal articles, but how does it play out on the ground? So maybe let's start with sort of positioning this a little more, giving us maybe an example or two, and then I would love to hear from David and Charlotte and Anna about how that's playing out there.
Should I start?
You want to go ahead, Marco? Yeah, go.
Sure. Thanks, man. Punya, those are really, really good questions, and I try to really condense my answer. So we are drawing from, like you mentioned, from critical pedagogy, also from Paulo Freire's work, and also people who have taken it forward. For example, and Juha will kill me now because I didn't say his name in the beginning, but we have basically one of the most known a professor in adult education in critical pedagogy in Finland. He is also part of the research group, and he is actually from the Tampere University, and so with him we try to sort of bridge also the universities as organizations. So from critical pedagogy from Paulo Freire, but from critical theory, one that at least has really got me thinking about everyday practices is, for example, Erich Fromm, Theodor Adorno, Horkheimer, and that was a really good point what you made on that this type of sort of academic paper writing and then sort of creating nice perhaps theories and not perhaps connecting them in practice. Of course, it's not that that clear cut. But anyway, so my background is actually as a developer. I was a developer first before I became a researcher. So I'm an instructional designer, interaction designer, a user experience designer. That's how I started. And I started already at that time when I was creating different kinds of platforms, for example, for kindergartens and kids and their parents and the kindergarten. I started questioning, so how does this actually affect the social relations, the relations between different actors and so forth? And so we're using these theoretical lenses to sort of give us new perspectives to actual practice. And this is what we wanted to do, for example, with the research with the teachers, is that we might bring certain things to discuss and see how they might be developed in practice. So we don't want to just, like you mentioned in a way, just write research papers, which of course it's good to have those people who also do that.
Sure. No, I mean, I was sort of making an extreme case just because it's sort of more fun to do that, right? But I think that the point that you made about, that I was reading one of your papers, the recent one about the COVID, post-COVID, that the hype and the technical, sort of that leadership often sees these problems that emerge, that there are technical solutions to it, while actually the stories are much more complicated in so many different ways. And so I mean, I don't want the other guests to not have a chance to speak. So I don't know, whoever wants to go first to take some of these ideas of critical digital pedagogy or taking a critical lens towards data and digitalization. How does that play out in your work? So give us a little bit of an introduction, and I'm just going to go from right to left on my screen. So Charlotte, maybe you can start us off, just introduce yourself and how these sort of ideas have played out in your work.
Hi. So really, I got involved with the CARD program around probably exactly a year ago, actually. And that was when I got in touch with Mark, one of my senior lecturers at university. And we just started having these conversations over via email of how really the distance learning programs had really exploded on an international scale at the time. Obviously, due to COVID, due to the pandemic, a lot of school settings, speaking from my own experience, had really made that leap into offering distance learning, online learning programs within 24 hours, sometimes maximum a week, really, notice given. So over that time, me and Mark were exchanging emails saying, what is going on? Trying to examine a lot of things, things from what platforms are they using, trying to work out the reasoning behind those platforms. And then it kind of went into a deeper conversation then about the philosophy of why we're using them, and individual teachers and settings and all kinds of things.
Okay. All right. So going on, Anna, tell us a little bit about yourself and how this work intersects with what you're doing.
Yeah, okay. And so I work at a social institute here in São Paulo, Brazil, and we intend to develop low-income students by providing them full scholarships in private schools and also a comprehensive soft skills development program. So then we started to think of how to scale our social impact, and then a digital solution fit perfectly. However, we have to be aware of these the biases and how can we choose the best digital solution, and not only that, but how to organize all of this to really ensure that we are developing soft skills such as critical thinking, for example. So how to develop critical thinking in a digital environment, in order to have these students critical thinkers and not only good workers for the market, for example, which is kind of a bias that we may find here in Brazil and in Latin America, actually. So as an MBA student, Mark is my teacher and has been my teacher for a couple of years, actually. Well, we, same as Charlotte, we started to have great conversations related to these issues. And then, of course, that as an applied research, it was perfect for me that I had this issue and this project at my work to be part of Cardi group and then to think critically on this project.
Thank you. David?
And after David talks for a bit, I'll have a follow-up question for all three of you. So, and I do recognize Anna now because I think you've popped into one of my classes, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, so my background is secondary school teaching in international private schools. And I've been teaching in Dubai for the last 8 years. I'm currently in an education consultant role, but it was kind of during the pandemic. And while I was teaching that I kind of had to become critical of how things were going digitally. And for me, and something I speak to Mark about a lot, is it's kind of the issue of public and private education and things like that. And one of the issues that kind of highlighted it for me and kind of put it into a bit of focus was when we first went online. Obviously, it happened very quickly. I think within the space of a week, we were out of the classroom and doing from home, 100% online. And schools were kind of finding their feet policy-wise. It was quick decisions and everything was kind of reactive. And I had the advantage of being in the MEL program. So I had access to educators all over the world that, depending on when the pandemic had hit in their country, had some experience in teaching online. So I was getting insights from different parts of Asia, Vietnam, the Czech Republic. And I was finding out how things like problems that had happened already and been solved. And what I did then is I brought it kind of to my school. And I kind of said, look, I've been speaking to these educators. This was an issue in Vietnam. This is how they fixed it. This was an issue in the Czech Republic. This is how they fixed it. Things like screen time and problems like that. And the basic kind of recommendation that I gave from a summary of kind of narratives from around the world was that you can't mirror a school day in a classroom to a school day online. Like you can't have 50-minute lessons where kids are in front of the screen, 7 50-minute lessons in a row where teachers are constantly in front of the screen. And this was kind of feedback I gave. And the issue was then taking into the context of the private schools in Dubai, because of the kind of market competition and the schools competing against each other for students and fees and things like that, they had to be shown to be giving the best online teaching. But we didn't know at the time what the best online teaching was because we had only been teaching online in secondary schools for a few weeks. But what had been decided as the best online teaching by kind of parents and some school leaders was that it should be just the closest thing to a school day as possible. So that still justified the schools not having to cut their private fees and things like that. So in terms of like linking, say, the point that you made about academics theorizing and teachers on the ground, it was the position that I had of linking the two, where I had access to some of the academics and I was also on the ground. I could kind of see and understand some of these issues. And those were frustrations that I had then, that we weren't adapting or we weren't kind of listening to the academics or to the experience of others. We were just kind of fitting the context that we had to have. We had to satisfy parents so that we couldn't cut fees and keep schools profitable and things like that. So I think that's an example of Dubai where the private industry comes into play and can have an effect on education in general. So that's what started.
Kurt, I know you have a question, but I just have a quick comment.
Yeah, sure,
I mean, one of the things that guided the silver lining for learning, that we started it like over a year ago, was exactly this discussion that, David, the point that you were making, which is that, yes, we are jumping into this technology. And I think one of the things that has stood out for me in the many conversations that we have had, particularly with people who are at the school or at the practitioner level, it really is about sort of before anything else, it is about the values and principles that you bring to the work that you do. The ones that worked well, who could pivot quickly, had already organizationally built a culture and a set of values around sort of valuing learning, valuing the learner, reaching out to the ones who, there was a humanistic sort of a perspective, and they could pivot and ask these questions, which is, it's not about screen time, it is really about engagement, and starting to see what are the actual possible benefits of this situation where everybody's stuck at home, and how can we think of our curriculum in new ways, how can we think of our teaching in new ways, bring in the, whatever your bubble is or your family is into that. And other organizations which hadn't sort of created those deeper, sort of hadn't had those deeper conversations, these sort of critical conversations, if you can call it that, found it super hard. They sort of reverted to like, okay, we are just going to replicate what we had before, which does not work in this medium, and actually raises lots of ethical questions about what we are putting our students through, what we are putting our learners through. And I think that's been a theme that sort of emerged through. So this sort of, what you guys are saying really resonates very well with what we have been sort of thinking and working and talking about as well. So Kurt, sorry, on to you.
No, does anyone want to comment on what Punya said? Mark, Marcos, David, Charlotte, Anna?
Yeah, well, just to support what Punya said about how it doesn't work to just try and teach as you normally would. Like one of the things that we found through a survey that Mark did through the kind of male teachers that were teaching at the time, most of the support came as technological support for teachers. So training obviously was quite brief because schools were going fully online very quickly, and you had to be quite selective about the training you provided. But most teachers got technological training. Do you know how to use Zoom? Do you know how to use Microsoft Teams? Can you use your LMS correctly? And it was assumed then that if you could use Teams, you could bring your lesson from the classroom to Teams and it would work correctly. And it doesn't. Well, like for some teachers it did, and for others it didn't. But it is difficult to take a physical classroom, how you would usually teach, and to just move it completely online without specific pedagogical thinking or training.
I'd be actually curious to hear from Anna, because you work with a very different population than I think the one that David works with, right? So I'm just curious about, in your attempt to reach, maybe the more difficult to reach populations through technology at a time of a pandemic, how has this conversation played out in your work?
Well, at my social institute and at my work exactly, we faced some challenges related to internet access, for example, because as we work as low-income students, we needed to map these challenges first, and then to help them to solve this problem, this basic problem. So this is really something important to say. And after that, we saw here in Brazil, the same as my colleagues are saying, we have the public system, educational system, and the private one. So the public educational system is it was like a gap last year because of the pandemic. We have millions of students without anything, not only because the lack of internet access for all, but because of the lack of teachers training and lack of structure in public schools. And then on the other hand, we have the private system working very well. I mean, working very well as they could, especially because of the structure and training and so on. So as we have deep social inequalities here, the pandemic last year deepened these social inequalities, especially in the educational field, because we had students from the public educational system without classes at all, and we have the students from private schools having classes and doing and moving on with their academic year and development year. So this is really concerning here. But in my work, actually, as we help these low-income students to achieve their full potential and providing them full scholarships in private schools. So we didn't have this problem at all, especially only the internet access and things like that. but they struggled to adapt to this new agenda and to this new way of having classes. Keeping at home, for example, it's different when you live in a favela, stay at home to watch a class, you know, as if you live in an apartment or in a good house with the structure. So this was a great issue here in my country.
Well, I'm curious about the research that you all have done with Mark and Markos, and it sounds like the topics are diverse. I listed some of them here in reading through your papers and through your bios. Inequalities, of course, the most serious issue, and you've addressed that and touched on that, in particular internet access, social emotional development, digital pedagogy, teacher networks, learning cultures, and just overall the school culture, how it changes in online environments. You've won awards actually for at least one of your papers, or two of them. Would you like to talk about your research in any of those areas, and then touch upon where your research might be going after this? Any of you? In particular, our wild cards.
Thanks,
I can
Kurt.
jump in and talk about mine, Dave.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, so me and Dave recently wrote a paper together, which was for the TCC in Hawaii.
Wait a minute, TCC means? Who knows?
Teaching,
But you won an
teaching,
award. Hey!
community, colleges, community.
Yeah. It's Bert and Curtis Ho, University of Hawaii. I think it's
Oh,
one
right,
of the
Curtis Ho,
one of the longest running online conferences. I think it's in its 26th year now. They've been having that. So yeah, that one.
That one.
Text them right now.
Yeah. So yeah, that was only recently as well. That was help me out here, Dave. Was it a month, 2 months ago?
Yeah, mid-April, I think that we spoke.
Yeah, it was in process for quite a while, because it's following on from these conversations that we've been having for the past year, really. It's looking at where things have come from in terms of digital pedagogies, really, that we've been seeing in school. And we were trying to use our post-COVID crystal ball there, weren't we, Dave, to imagine where life will take us in Dubai private schools in the future, really. So yeah, Dave, do you want to add a bit more?
Yeah, so like it wasn't a traditional research paper, and I'd say it might even be frowned upon in certain research circles, but it was predictive speculative fiction is the framework that we used, and we just kind of took it was for an assignment for the Masters in Education Leadership initially in technology enhanced learning, I think. I could be wrong. And then we had to, I think at the start, we were just going to frame it as dystopian fiction and kind of predict the worst case scenario if things were continuing as they started, with the sharing of data and extended screen time and things like that. And I think then we made the better decision to make it a kind of a balanced speculative fiction piece where we had a utopian fiction presented, kind of a narrative of what a school could achieve if they used online learning correctly. So like one example was schools increasing their catchment area outside of the city or even the country. And that example kind of came from when I was doing blended teaching in September when we reopened. One of my students was stuck in China because of the travel ban. So I was teaching some students in a classroom in Dubai, some students in their homes in Dubai, and a student in their home in China. So we had the utopian future where these were possible for schools. They could do digital open days. Students that had anxiety about classrooms could achieve from home. And then we looked at the kind of literature with those. And then we balanced it with a dystopian future where we looked at some of the issues we were seeing that we've discussed here so far. Data being shared and teachers being stressed out and having to do as much IT support as teaching. And then we kind of just discussed where we thought things would go and recommendations to kind of meet somewhere in the middle and keep things on track. So it's different. We were happy with how it came out.
we're just going to kind of add to that as well and just say that like me and Dave had our similarities and differences in terms of the students we were working with in schools and online, in terms that Dave was teaching secondary, I think that's right, Dave.
Yeah.
And that I was based in an early years setting. So obviously there was very different issues that came up with those different age groups, but some similarities too.
Yeah, I recently did a presentation to Saudi Arabia, and the parents there are going a little crazy bonkers because the early childhood kids were taking online learning in the early morning, and then the middle school related were taking later in the afternoon. Then the older kids were going towards the late afternoon to evening, and so their kids were in online environments all day long. That was in Riyadh. Is it the same true in Dubai as well?
For us, we had in the secondary and the primary would have been a similar time schedule, not changed as much. The primary kids would have finished a bit earlier, but the secondary school students had kind of a standard timetable. So Charlotte, I don't know, was early years different for you?
Yeah, so it was all very intense, as in the students would start their day like as a normal school day, and so they're expected to sit at the computer for registration at 7:30 in the morning, and then there's tasks throughout the whole day, some synchronous, some that kind of homework style tasks, but really those sort of 4 or 5-year-olds are expected to sit at their computer for full-on screen time from 7:30 in the morning until 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
So we just heard I just heard from Chris Deedy, and his commencement is running long, so he won't be able to join us, but we do have a question from him.
Yeah, I will.
Punya, jump in here.
Yeah, I will. So a couple of things. So one, I love that idea of the dystopian, utopian fiction, and it's kind of interesting. I just dropped a link here to a project that we just completed, and we got sort of award-winning science fiction writers to imagine the futures of learning. Then we got like academic experts to respond to that, and I moderated then a conversation between the science fiction author, and this was posted on Slate. I just dropped the link there, and it was, I mean, those conversations were among the most interesting conversations that I've been a part of, because I don't get to talk to science fiction authors. That's not part of my purview per se, but getting them with their ideas of thoughts about, I mean, and they could write about anything. We just gave them this broad thing about learning, so it wasn't schooling. It was, one story is about like within a university setting, but the other two are very different. But I think they raise such provocative, ethical sort of conundrums, which I think fiction does so well compared to, instead of trying to, as academics trying to describe it. Anyway, I want to move us a little bit, because we have been talking about digitization, talking about digital learning, talking about online learning. There is this huge thing, I think, around data that I think that as educators, we really haven't confronted. I don't think we have thought really hard about how, I mean, in some ways, COVID has been the greatest bonanza to Zoom and Google and Microsoft, in terms of now they have data traces on us and our children from 3 years onward. We are complicit in this, in the sense that we put pictures of our kids on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter or whatever. So we are a part of the problem here. But there is also great possible benefits to sort of having this data, which, if done in the right way, can help us, provide, interventions or identify problems early on and so on. So I would love to hear, what you think are the two, one biggest strength of having this data stream now, and what are some of the potential pitfalls that we need to be careful about. And then I think we can follow up after that to the question from Chris, which is sort of asking you about what forms of analyzing data would you be comfortable with, right? And so let's start with, like, what are sort of the potentials and risks of this? Because I think I really don't think as educators we are paying enough attention to how much of our data is out there and how it can be used / misused. So we'd love to get some thoughts about that. I don't know, Marco, who wants to go first on this? And then I think segue to the question that Chris raised, like, what would be something that you would be comfortable with? Thank you. Yeah.
So if I could jump in first, then I completely agree with what you just said, Punya, that I don't think there's enough awareness. So one of the things we're trying to kind of do through our Master in Educational Leadership program is actually raise awareness of educational leaders of the data that's being collected and where does it go and who owns that data and so on. And of course, there's important things to recognize in terms of location. For example, in the European Union, in Finland, as part of that, we have got things like GDPR, and there are some regulatory frameworks to protect that data, but that's not the case in a lot of other places as well. So one thing is kind of an awareness, a literacy of understanding those data trails. But I think the other thing as well is recognizing the limitations of data. It is true that we have these trails, but we must be careful to recognize what they actually are. They're very often proxies for things. Like, for example, in a learning management system, a click is taken for engagement, which is then taken to mean learning. And no, it's not, it's a click. And the student may then have walked away and gone and done all kinds of things. So we have to be really careful that when we look at this data, first of all, what is it really telling us, and what is the data that's missing? What about the data that's absent that we can't collect in an easier way? And then the other thing that I think is really important is putting a human into this mix as well. I'm really against ADM, but automated decision making, where there's no person, particularly a professional educator, in the loop to help and guide students and parents and educational leaders to making decisions. So we saw in the UK last year with A-level results, a mess that ended up. And I couldn't believe when we were seeing students in the street waving banners, basically an expletive that we're going out live on YouTube that I can't repeat, that F the algorithm.
The mutant algorithm there, Mark.
Yeah. But the thing is, I thought it would be 10 years before we saw that. And suddenly, because of the pandemic, like people had woken up to that challenge in data. So sorry to kind of go off on all kinds of trails there, but there's all kinds of things we need to be aware of as educators, as educational leaders, and then again, the narratives that go with the data. And without getting into kind of sounding too postmodern, but there's data, which could be clicks, it's binary, but then there's the narratives that go with it. And too often tech vendors will tell us this data means a certain thing. And when you step back and say, actually, no, it doesn't. It doesn't tell us how much they've learned. It tells us, as I say, how many links they clicked or how many hours they were logged in and so on. So that's my opening, and I'm sure others there, maybe Charlotte with early years and some of the platforms, or Anna Paula, some of the others can pick up. Yeah.
Yeah. So I just want to add, if I can just add one thing, there is just to layer one more thing, Mark, on what you said, there is also an equity issue here. So what we are seeing, at least in the US, is that if you are in a school district where the parents are well educated and they know what this data things mean, the contracts that are signed with, let's say, Google Classroom and so on, specify that all the data will be erased at the end of the year. Now, as to whether it's actually done or not, I don't know. And in the cloud, the data seems to exist forever. However, at least contractually, it is there. It's the districts which are more impoverished, who are more in need of these tools, where these contractual things don't happen. So you see existing inequities continue to be replicated in these data systems. So you end up having more data on people who have less power in the system anyway. And I think that's another layer to this sort of complicated. Sorry, and I'm interrupting what you were saying. Please go ahead.
No problem. And for example, here in Brazil, we started regulating data collection this year. So can you imagine? And it's been executing this year. So with many issues, many gaps. And yes, there is this great inequality here in Brazil too. We don't have this regulation in public schools, for example, as we have many issues and many challenges related to public schools and public educational system. And the dimension of our country is really another issue. So a digital solution seems perfect to solve all our problems. So we don't think critically in terms of, okay, and the data of our students, and what are you going to do, and how are you going to deal with this? So this is a great issue here.
I was just going to add to that as well, and say about the one of the platforms that I have been thinking about over the past over a year now. I don't know if I'm allowed. Am I allowed to name names of platforms? No. Okay, that's fine. Well, the one I have in mind is one that monitors young children's behaviours, and me and Mark have had many conversations about this particular platform. Whereby so
you can,
this is
that is
a
name you can, that name you can name, go for it.
Okay, all right, it's Class Dojo. So this is something that I know a few educators and schools are familiar with, and I've had concerns about this in the past, about how ethical it is to be awarding children's behaviours and deducting points for behaviours. It just doesn't sit well with me. So that has been an issue I've been feeling for some time. However, with the leap online that happened 12 months ago and is continuing to happen, it's now that the parents are more involved in those systems as well. So you've not only got the effects on the children of seeing, well, if I clean up a mess that isn't mine, I get a point for it. And now that's taken online. The parents are also aware, oh, my child had a point for something. And why do they have a point? And then I'm receiving messages from parents then saying, my child did something really well today, but you didn't award him a point. I just feel that whole, collection of data in that way is not a positive at all.
Thank you, Charlotte. So, Marco, there was this question from Chris that I would like you to sort of address, which is, he said, given these challenges, right, that data can be misused and all of these things, what automated forms of analyzing data about students do you support, if any? And if you do, how do these approaches avoid the issues you raise about other types of automated data analysis, some of which we have already discussed here?
Thanks, Punya, and thanks, Chris, for the really difficult question, I would say. I think the sort of the jury hasn't decided yet, I would say. And to understand this area a bit more, we have included another person in our research group, Mr. Esa Kujansu. He's a teacher from industrial engineering, and he is also teaching how to build algorithms and he does machine learning himself, so he understands this also on that level. So I think our work is sort of still in the beginning, but in general, without trying to really sound a super expert in this area, I would say I'm still thinking what to support. Like I referred to George's keynote in the beginning, and he seemed to be also a bit hesitant to support basically, I think, any forums without a person being there. But then again, for example, I have worked with Open University Indonesia, or Indonesia Open University. I never remember which way it is, but they have roughly, on their at least on their website, they say they have 1 million students and 300,000 active. And we've
had the former rector of the Open U of Indonesia in one of our shows.
Oh, lovely.
Tian Belawati. Yeah. She's been a guest actually in one of our shows. I don't know. I've been dealing with the same thing, but they call it Terbuka is the actually the name.
Universitas Terbuka, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when I discuss about these things with them, it's totally different with that many students than what we have in Finland. The data masses become bigger, perhaps. That can be used to sort of, I wouldn't like to say make the organization more efficient or effective and place like how you decide on resource, for example, how many teachers and so forth, because these are really big groups. Right. But the problem that I see in this is that who gets to decide the data points, what data is used, what data, like what Mark said, what data is left out, because it's easy to sort of, for example, judge teachers based on certain data, but it doesn't show the organizational sort of certain processes and so forth within which the teachers need to work. So, you know,
sure,
I think
that's helpful. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that, at Arizona State University, we are a pretty big university, we're 100,000 students. And we are we are known for access. Like, if you, we are not, like we take only 2% of those who apply. We are very committed to reaching out, and we have a lot of first generation students. And ASU has done a phenomenal job of trying to identify red flags. And one of the things that comes up is that students who stop attending classes in their first semester usually end up dropping out within the next couple of years. And so now we have a pinpoint. So now people go in, and the moment they see that a student has missed a class, an advisor reaches out to them. So it's a personal connection, but the data is the only way you could have identified. So you do these correlations, you do these sort of mapping towards the future. And now, to me, that's a very ethical and a thoughtful use of data. It's not using data to give you a grade or to assign whether you have learned something, but identifying, and data lets us do that, right? And that, okay, there is, in fact, you can pinpoint down to the level of that in this math class, people who mess up this assignment tend to, and there's a cascade effect. All right, we need to focus more attention on understanding differential calculus or whatever the problem may be, and it's going to lead students to success down the road. I mean, so to me, those are the sort of thoughtful uses of data. But again, it comes back to the broader values and perspectives that you're bringing to it. Are you aiming for efficiency, or are you aiming for student success? Like, which is the thing that you're putting at the center of your narrative, or your, like you said, Mark, your narrative? Like, what's your story? Right? So, go ahead, Mark.
Punya, when you say personalization, I have to remind you that Arizona State is probably sending Sunny. Sunny's probably sending the message, which is your AI bot at ASU, as well as a human. I'm sure there's a human in the loop too, but that's pretty sophisticated from what I understand your chat.
No, I mean, that to me, that's one of the biggest successes of ours is improving student success over. I mean, we've done a pretty good job of particularly first-gen students who come from communities where college is not something that they had thought would be part of their lives. And they come into this culture, which they're completely not attuned to. They have no idea how higher ed works. And so the failures that happen there are not because of the student and their capabilities or their potential. It's because the system is not understanding who they are. Anyway, Mark, I know you were going to make a point, so.
Yeah, actually, Punya, in a way, you've made it for me already. So I'm kind of sorry because it's duplicating. But in the program I manage, which is a distance learning program with participants all over the world, I do, after the first week, go and look at the data to see who's logged into the learning management system. Okay, and so I am looking at that data. But the difference is that, as you say, it's about the narrative, if you will, the ideology behind that. So I'm looking at that, not as surveillance, not to kind of who's done the most studying, but it's actually coming from a pedagogy of care. It's driven by the ideas of people like Nell Noddings, that, well, so why haven't you logged in that first week? And what can we do to help you to do that? Like, is it because of internet connection? Is it personal or whatever? But that's a person who reaches out. So we haven't gone to bots, because I think it's important. Now, when you have 300,000 students or however many thousands, that becomes more problematic. I recognize that. But I think it's just, the reason is, why are you doing it, and how are you going to handle it once you get that information as well? So again, it comes back to this ADM issue, this automatic decision-making issue, and what point the human comes into that process to use their judgment. Of course, humans often get it wrong as well, though, of course.
Mark, I'm going to have to ask, go ahead, Punya.
No, I was going to make some silly dad joke. Go for it.
Oh, please. because that's going to lead to my question, actually.
Go ahead.
So, Mark, we've had 57 shows. This is number 58. And we've not had a person like you, okay? Because you are, it says in your bio, right? The pedagogy of humor guy in the humor affordances in digital learning environments of the Handle Research Group. So we've not had a humor person other than Punya every week. So tell us what the heck a humor person does within Cardi group, and what the future for this. Are you going on the road and we're going to see you perform?
No. That's the short answer. No, actually, every good educator knows this, okay, in my opinion. Good learning, a good student experience is about engagement. It's relational. Education is relational. It's about a relation between an educator, a student, and a relationship to a body of knowledge and an institution. But it's about the relations there, right? And so our view is that humor can help inform that relation. So it's a way of an educator becoming more of a human to their students. So it's not actually about doing terrible dad jokes necessarily. It isn't about becoming a stand-up comedian and turning education into edutainment, but it is looking for how humor might be used in education to improve engagement, particularly in this digital environment where we're now mediating everything through cameras and screens. So is there a way, both synchronously or asynchronously, we can use humor to improve engagement? And I'm working with our School of Media, who does screenwriting and comedy writing, to look at that as a research topic. So that's the short answer.
I just had to ask, since we haven't had anyone in the first 57 shows who had that in their bio, so we had to clarify that a little bit for the audience. We do have a couple minutes left before I need to introduce the next show. We have about a minute and a half left.
Hello.
If Chris would like to jump in for anything and say hi to the group.
Well, I just regret that I had a conflict with a graduation event at Harvard. It ran almost half an hour long. There was just nothing that I could do. I couldn't leave, but I want to thank you for coming to the episode and sharing your thoughts about this really important topic. I post our episodes on LinkedIn in advance to try to get people involved, and your episode drew over 2,300 looks. So this is clearly important work that you're doing, and we're grateful that you came and shared it with us.
Agreed.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank
I look forward to watching the show.
Any of you, David or Anna or Mark or Charlotte or Marco, would like a final, any of you can make a final 10, 15-second comment, not a long one, but anyone have something pressing they'd like to say to close?
Mark, you're always good in closing.
And we need the jokes. Where are the jokes? No
No,
pressure.
Okay, I just want to say, like, one of the key things here in all of this is about including educators in the discussion. All right, I think that's where things have failed. I think in terms of going online, and particularly going online in the pandemic, there's been narratives from vendors about what technology can do and the solutions it can bring, and there's been nobody really thinking deeply about the claims being made. So educators, by becoming involved in that and being able to step back and say, well, hang on a minute, what about this is a really important thing. So that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to bridge that gap between theory and practice into praxis, and make sure that educators are the important professionals that they really should be in this discussion.
And it's been a delight to have 3 educators with us from Dubai and from Sao Paulo. And I really hope that the COVID issue is resolved quickly, so there isn't so much emotional baggage that kids come to school with in Brazil. I'm sure, Anna, you're facing a lot of challenges there, more than probably you can describe in a 1-hour show. So thank you for taking the time out to join us here. Anna, I'll give you the last comment.
Thank you for that. Yes, it's been really challenging, especially because we miss a good leader in our country, unfortunately. as we have this far right guy as our president, everything is going really bad here, unfortunately. So yeah, thanks for that. And I'm sure that education is the key to solve or to address this problem in our democracy, and this big issue in our democracy this time. So thank you for that, and thank you for having this opportunity.
Yeah, I'm going to plug the next show. It's show 59 on universal design for learning. We're going to have Susie Gronseth, who just won an alumni award for my university from Indiana, and she's at the University of Houston. She's edited a book with Elizabeth Dalton, Betsy Dalton from University of Delaware, and they have about 90 contributors in this book. They'll bring 2 of them in next week from Santiago, Chile, and from Stellenbosch University in South Africa. So we'll hear some diverse views about UDL and what it is and where it's going. And it's going to be at a different time next week at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. So I hope you can join us for that show, show 59. It's time to be inclusive and include UDL. Thank you very much for attending this show, and hope to see you next time.